If I signed the papers at 9:14 that morning, my sister would walk away with the only land my grandfather left me, and I'd be the one paying the property taxes. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. A small white clock hung crooked above a framed photo of a mountain lake that looked nothing like Colorado. The closing agent, her nameplate said Karen Holt, sat at the head of the table with a blue folder in front of her and a stack of sticky flags already stuck to the pages like little warning lights. She smiled the way people smile when they've done this 1,000 times and don't want you to slow them down. Across from me, my sister Brooke wore a cream blazer that still had a price tag crease at the cuff. She kept her phone face down on the table, but every few seconds she tapped it with 2 fingers like she could make time move faster. Her husband, Evan, sat next to her with a pen already uncapped. It wasn't even a nice pen. It was one of those cheap plastic ones, with the title company logo on the side, as if signing your life away came free with the paperwork. Karen cleared her throat and slid the folder toward me. Okay, Maya, if you'll just initial here, here, and here, and then we'll do signatures on the flagged pages. We should be wrapped up in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Like that was all it took to rewrite a man's last wish. Brooke's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. See? Easy. I told you it was routine. I looked down at the first page. It was a deed. The letters were crisp and heavy, the kind of black ink that looks official even when it's wrong. My name was printed in a box near the bottom. So was Brooke's. That part I expected. We were both listed as beneficiaries in the trust documents, mine for the land, hers for the rest. My grandfather had been precise. He believed in lists, in boundaries, in clear lines drawn on maps. He had spent most of his life outside, working with his hands and his patience, and when he made a decision, he made it to last. But then my eyes caught a line above the signature block. Grantor hereby conveys development rights and associated easements. My throat went dry. The room got quieter in a strange way, like someone had closed a door somewhere and sealed the air inside with us. Brooke leaned forward. Just initial. You don't have to read every word. I do, I said. My voice came out flatter than I expected. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, fast and tight. Karen gave a small laugh, polite but impatient. Of course you can read it, but I'll just tell you this is standard language for this type of transfer. It's all been reviewed. Reviewed by who? I asked. Evan's knee bumped my leg under the table like it was an accident. His sneaker was clean, bright white, the kind of shoe that never sees dirt. I stared at it for a second, like it had wandered into the wrong story. Brooke's smile held. By our attorney. He's very good. You don't need to make this a whole thing. I turned the page. The flags Karen had set were placed with careful confidence, like she was guiding me down a hallway where all the doors were already locked. Initial here, sign here, date here. On the third page, the word irrevocable jumped out at me, bolded in the middle of a paragraph. My fingers tightened around the corner of the paper. The edge felt sharp. I could smell Evan's cologne, something sweet and expensive that didn't belong in a room that smelled like burnt coffee. Can you explain this part? I asked, tapping the paragraph with my nail. Karen leaned in, squinting as if she hadn't seen it before. That clause it's referring to the easement transfer. Again, it's standard. It means I can't undo it, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The words sat on the table between us like a cold plate. Brooke exhaled like I was embarrassing her in public. Maya, stop. You're doing that thing where you spiral. I blinked, slow. I knew that line. She'd used it on me since we were kids. Whenever I noticed something she didn't want noticed, I was spiraling. Whenever I asked for a receipt, I was paranoid. Whenever I didn't hand over what she wanted, I was making it weird. Karen's smile thinned. If you're uncomfortable, we can call your attorney. I don't have one here, I said. Brooke's eyebrows lifted. That's not our problem. My stomach rolled. I forced myself to keep turning pages. The documents weren't just about transferring the land into an LLC. They were about stripping it down piece by piece and handing the parts that mattered to someone else. Development rights. Mineral rights. Access easements. The words were clean and legal, but I could see what they were doing like I could see a bruise forming under skin. Karen slid a small tray of mints toward the center of the table. The mints were individually wrapped in glossy plastic. Someone had put them there to make people feel taken care of while they signed. A dead fly lay on the windowsill behind Evan's shoulder. It was on its back, legs curled in, like it had simply decided to stop. No one else looked at it. No one moved to flick it away. It made me feel oddly calm, like I wasn't the only thing in this room that didn't belong. Brooke tapped her phone again. It's 9:11. Evan has a call at 10. Can we please not drag this out? I didn't look up. I kept my eyes on the paper. Why are you in such a hurry? Evan laughed softly. Because adults have schedules. Adults. Like I was still the little sister who didn't know how the world worked. Like I wasn't the one who had been paying the county taxes on that land since the trust handed it over to me. Like I wasn't the one who had spent nights on the phone with the assessor's office, trying to make sure nothing got updated without my consent. Karen folded her hands. Maya, this is meant to help you. The LLC is a protection. It keeps liability off you personally. Brooke nodded hard, like she wanted to hammer the point into my forehead. Exactly. You're always talking about being responsible. This is responsible. Responsible. That word had been used on me like a leash since the day our grandfather died. His name was Ray Caldwell. Most people called him Ranger Ray because he had worked for the state park system for decades and never really stopped carrying himself like he was on duty. He wore the same faded cap everywhere, even to the grocery store. When he ate, he wiped his hands with a napkin as if he could scrub the world clean. He wasn't perfect. He could be stubborn and blunt. But he was the only adult in my life who didn't make me feel like love came with a bill attached. Brooke and I grew up in the same house, same small town, same father who came and went, and same mother who got tired in quiet ways. But Brooke had always been the one who knew how to get what she wanted. She didn't ask. She arranged. She pushed. She smiled. And if you resisted, she found the soft part in you and pressed until you moved. When Grandpa Ray bought that land 40 acres outside of Berthoud, scrub grass and cottonwoods and a narrow creek that only ran strong in spring, he didn't buy it to build anything. He bought it because he liked that it stayed quiet. He liked that the sky there felt wide. He liked that no one had claimed it yet with fences and signs. He took me out there when I was 16. We drove in his old truck with the bench seat that smelled like sun-baked vinyl. He made me get out and walk with him along the property line, pointing out old survey markers half buried in dirt. He carried a folded map in his back pocket and a cheap compass. He stopped at the creek and crouched down, touching the water with his fingers like it was something sacred. People think land is just land, he said. It's not. It's time. It's choices. It's the one thing you can't make more of. When he got sick, he called me to his kitchen table and slid a folder across to me. A different folder than this one, but the same feeling. Paper that could change everything. He'd set up a trust with rules. The land would go to me. Not because I was his favorite, not because he hated Brooke, but because he knew what she would do if she got her hands on it. He didn't say that out loud. He didn't have to. His eyes did. Brooke had smiled at the funeral and hugged people and cried at the right times. Then, 2 weeks later, she asked me what my plans were for that empty dirt. It's not empty, I told her. She laughed. Maya, it's weeds. And now, sitting in this conference room with a crooked clock and a blue folder and a pen pushed toward my hand, I understood something with a kind of clarity that made my palms sweat. They weren't asking me to share. They weren't asking me to be part of a plan. They were trying to make me sign away the part of my grandfather that was still alive in the world. Karen slid the pen closer. If you'll just initial the bottom of page 4. I lifted my hand, but instead of taking the pen, I pulled the folder back toward me. The paper made a soft scraping sound against the table, small but loud in the silence that followed. Brooke's eyes narrowed. Maya, she warned. Like my name was a door she could slam. My heart hit my ribs again. I could feel the heat in my face, the prickling behind my eyes. I swallowed hard and made my voice steady. I need a bathroom, I said. Karen looked surprised. Evan's jaw tightened. Brooke's hand moved, quick, and her fingers closed around my wrist under the table, squeezing like she used to when we were kids and she didn't want me to talk. You don't need a bathroom, she hissed through her smile. Her nails dug into my skin. I didn't pull away. I just looked at her hand like it belonged to a stranger. Then I looked up at Karen, held her gaze, and said, yes, I do. And in that moment, with the clock inching toward 9:14 and the pen still waiting like a trap, I realized that the story I'd been told about my family, about loyalty, about love, about what we owed each other was about to break apart right in front of me. And there was no way to put it back together once it did. I walked out of the conference room before Brooke could tighten her grip again. Karen pointed down the hallway without speaking, and I kept moving until the door closed behind me and the carpet muffled their voices. The bathroom light flickered when I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of soap and something metallic, and the mirror above the sink showed a face that looked steadier than I felt. I locked myself into the far stall and sat down, even though I didn't need to. My hands were shaking just enough to make my watch band rattle against the metal divider. I pressed my palms against my knees and breathed slowly, counting seconds the way I used to when fieldwork deadlines stacked up and maps wouldn't align. It wasn't just paperwork in that folder. It was a plan. And plans didn't appear overnight. I pulled my phone out of my bag and opened the photos I'd taken over the last few weeks. screenshots of county emails, copies of notices, a scanned letter from the Larimer County Planning Department asking for confirmation of interest in rezoning, my name typed at the bottom of forms I hadn't filled out, my supposed authorization granting preliminary inquiries about development access. The first time I saw those, I'd assumed it was a clerical error. I called the county office, waited through hold music, and explained that I hadn't submitted anything. The clerk asked me to verify the file number. Then she paused, long enough for me to picture her leaning closer to her screen. "Well," she said, "careful. We received digital copies with supporting identification." Identification. I hung up that day and drove home on autopilot, hands locked at 10 and 2 on the wheel. My apartment parking lot was full, and I sat there for 5 minutes before going inside, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror and wondering how many documents existed with my name attached to something I didn't know about. I told Brooke about it that evening, keeping my voice neutral. She laughed. "You're overthinking," she said. "Someone probably fat-fingered a form." I wanted to believe her. I always wanted to believe her. That habit had roots. We grew up in Longmont in a narrow 2-story house with thin walls and uneven heating. Brooke and I shared a bedroom until she left for college. She had posters of city skylines and fashion ads taped over her bed. Mine had field guides and old park maps Grandpa Ray brought me. She woke early and practiced smiling in the mirror before school pictures. I woke early because she told me I took too long in the bathroom. She learned fast how people worked. Teachers liked her, coaches liked her, parents liked her. When something broke, she could talk her way out of blame. When she needed something, she found a reason it was already hers. I didn't hate her for it. I admired her, in the way younger siblings admire gravity. It simply existed. But admiration shifts when you grow older and realize gravity can also pin you down. I left the stall and splashed water on my face. It was cold enough to make my eyes sting. I dried my hands with rough paper towels and stared at my phone again. Another image caught my eye. The metadata screen my coworker Dylan had helped me pull up. He'd leaned over my desk after hours and showed me how to track document timestamps. "Look," he said, pointing. "This submission originated from a private IP linked to a commercial office network." "Which office?" He shrugged. "Hard to say without more digging." "But it wasn't your apartment." That was the moment I stopped assuming accidents. I slipped my phone back into my bag and walked out. The hallway felt longer returning than it had leaving. When I pushed the conference room door open, conversation stopped. Brooke released a breath through her nose, annoyed. Evan leaned back with his arms crossed. Karen adjusted her papers. "Everything okay?" Karen asked. "Yes," I said, sitting down. My chair creaked softly under me. I pulled the folder closer again, slower this time. I just needed a minute. Brooke's foot tapped under the table. "We're burning daylight." I met her eyes. "Then explain why development rights are being transferred." Her expression flickered. "Just a fraction." Then it smoothed. "It's administrative," she said. "So we can manage the land better. With an LLC I don't control?" "You'll benefit," Evan cut in. "Tax protection, future appreciation, all of that." I turned another page. The words were still there, plain as fence posts. Permanent conveyance, exclusive control, authority to negotiate use agreements. It didn't require legal training to understand the shape of what they were building. Ownership stripped into technicalities. Karen folded her hands again. "If you have concerns, we can schedule another time." Brooke's head snapped toward her. "No, we're finishing today." Silence fell. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone in another office laughed faintly through the wall. I set the papers down carefully. "Grandpa didn't leave me that land so someone else could decide what happens to it." Brooke's voice sharpened. "Grandpa didn't live in the real world anymore. Land sitting idle helps nobody. It helps me." "It helps you what?" "Pretend you're protecting nature while paying taxes you complain about every year?" My jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong about the taxes. They were steady and inconvenient, but they were mine. I budgeted for them. I drove out to the acreage twice a year, walked along the creek, checked the markers, picked up litter left by passers-by who treated open space like a suggestion. That land wasn't an investment spreadsheet. It was the last place where I could still hear Grandpa Ray's voice telling me how to read cloud shapes and track animal prints. Selling its control felt like erasing handwriting from a letter I still reread. Evan slid the pen forward again. "We're not bulldozing anything tomorrow. This just positions us." Positions us. The phrase stayed in the air. I picked up the pen, rolling it between my fingers. Plastic, light, disposable. I watched Brooke's shoulders loosen, just a little, thinking I was done resisting. Then I set the pen back down. "I want copies of every document," I said. "And I want the submission history attached to the zoning inquiry filed under my name." Karen hesitated. Brooke leaned forward. That's unnecessary. It's necessary to me. Brooke stared at me for a long moment. I could see calculation working behind her eyes, gears turning. She reached for her phone and checked the screen, then placed it down again. Fine, she said finally. Take copies. Review them tonight. But we reschedule tomorrow morning. No more delays. Karen nodded, relieved at compromise. I can arrange that. I gathered the pages, stacking them carefully. The paper felt heavier than it should have. My bag zipper caught halfway as I slid them inside, and for a second my hands trembled again. I forced them still. As we stood, Brooke's hand brushed my arm. Gentle now. You're making this harder than it needs to be, she said quietly. I looked at her. At the familiar shape of her face. At the confidence she wore. Like a second skin. Maybe, I said. We walked out together into the parking lot. Sunlight bounced off windshields and warmed the pavement. Evan unlocked their SUV with a chirp. Karen waved from the doorway and disappeared inside. Brooke paused beside her car. Tomorrow, 9 sharp. I nodded. She studied me another second, searching for something. Maybe weakness. Maybe agreement. Then she got in, and they drove away. I stood there alone, heat rising off the asphalt, my bag heavy on my shoulder. I pulled my phone out again and opened the photo gallery. The evidence I'd collected wasn't complete, but it wasn't nothing either. Emails, metadata, notices. Enough to show that someone had tried to move things without me. I locked the screen and headed toward my car. The door handle was hot under my fingers. As I started the engine, I understood something clearly. This wasn't just about paperwork or impatience. This had been building quietly, step by step, long before that blue folder crossed the table. And whatever tomorrow morning brought, I was no longer walking into it unprepared. I drove straight from the title office to the acreage instead of going home. I didn't plan it. My hands just turned the wheel toward Highway 287, and soon the town thinned out into stretches of brown grass and wire fencing. The sky was wide the way it only gets along the Front Range, pale blue and open, and traffic noise faded behind me. I kept the radio off. The sound of tires on pavement was enough. The dirt road that led to the property hadn't changed. It still dipped slightly where spring runoff cut through, and it still kicked dust up behind the car like smoke. I parked by the gate and stepped out into wind that smelled faintly of dry weeds and cold water. The chain on the gate clinked when I unhooked it. Grandpa Ray had installed it himself years ago, tightening the bolts until the metal sang. I walked past the gate and let it swing closed behind me. The ground crunched under my boots. The cottonwoods along the creek were bare this time of year, branches gray and skeletal, but they still marked the bend in the land the way they always had. I followed the familiar path down toward the water, my bag slung across my shoulder, the folder inside bumping against my hip. Standing there, with nothing around but wind and distant highway hum, the conference room felt unreal. The fluorescent lights, the mints, Brooke's tapping phone, it was hard to hold those two worlds in the same head. I crouched by the creek and touched the surface with my fingers. It was cold enough to sting. Grandpa used to say cold water wakes up whatever part of you is asleep. He brought me here during summers when I was younger, handing me a cheap plastic net and telling me to look for insects clinging to rocks. Pay attention to the small things, he'd say. They tell you what's coming. I didn't notice how much I missed those words until they weren't around anymore. I sat on a flat stone and pulled the folder from my bag. The pages caught the wind, rattling faintly. I read through them again, slower this time, tracing sentences with my finger. Conveyance. Control. Authority. Everything written clean and dry, but underneath it I could see the shape of something impatient and hungry. I flipped to the section listing the LLC structure. Brooke's name appeared first, Evan's second. Mine third, listed as a minority interest holder. Voting rights assigned by percentage. Operational authority assigned to managing members. It didn't require a law degree to see how that math worked out. I exhaled slowly. The air tasted sharp. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Brooke's name. You calm now? I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. I'm reviewing everything, I typed. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Good. Just remember we're trying to help you. I locked the screen without answering. The wind picked up and pushed dry leaves along the bank. I gathered the pages and slid them back into the folder, then stood and walked farther along the property line. The old survey markers were still there, metal rods half buried in dirt, just like when Grandpa showed them to me. I kicked aside weeds around one and checked the number stamped into it. The habit automatic. That land had never felt like something I owned. It felt like something I was responsible for. Taxes, upkeep, paperwork. Even when I complained about the cost, there was a quiet pride in knowing I was the one keeping it intact. I returned to the car after another half hour, dust streaking my jeans, and drove back toward town. By the time I reached my apartment complex, the sun had shifted, and shadows stretched across the parking lot. I carried the folder inside and set it on my kitchen table. My apartment was small but orderly. Maps rolled in tubes by the couch, hiking boots by the door, a framed photo of Grandpa Ray leaning against the wall instead of hung, because I never decided exactly where it belonged. I poured a glass of water and sat down with the papers again. This time, I opened my laptop. I drafted an email to the county clerk, attaching the documents and asking for confirmation on whether any additional submissions had been logged under my name. Then I sent another to Dylan, asking if he could check metadata on the LLC registration filings. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I wrote one more message, this time to a number saved months earlier. Hi, this is Maya Caldwell. We spoke about land use consultation. I need to schedule a call. I hit send and leaned back in my chair. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Hours passed in small tasks. Highlighting clauses. Cross-checking parcel numbers. Reading about easement structures until the words blurred. The work steadied me. Each detail I understood replaced a piece of panic with something closer to control. At around 9, my phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? Miss Caldwell? This is Erin Lawson. You reached out about consultation? Her voice was clear and direct, the tone of someone used to sorting complicated situations. Yes, I said. Thank you for calling. I summarized everything. The zoning inquiry, the LLC documents, the closing scheduled for the next morning. She listened without interrupting. Finally, she said, "Bring every document you have to my office at 8. Do not sign anything before we meet." Relief moved through me so sharply I almost laughed. I won't. We ended the call, and I gathered the papers into my bag again. I set my alarm and moved through the apartment, turning off lights, checking locks, the routine grounding. Sleep came in fragments. I kept replaying moments from childhood. Brooke convincing neighbors to give her things meant for both of us. Brooke explaining situations in ways that always favored her version of events. I remembered the day Grandpa told me about the trust, the way his voice stayed gentle but firm. This isn't about picking sides, he'd said. It's about making sure you have room to stand. Morning arrived cold and pale. I dressed quickly, grabbed my bag, and headed out before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The roads were quiet, and frost edged the grass along the highway. Erin Lawson's office sat in a modest brick building near downtown Loveland. I parked and went inside. She met me in a small conference room with plain wood furniture and a stack of yellow legal pads. She flipped through the documents carefully, marking sections with a pen. After several minutes, she looked up. "You were right to hesitate," she said. "Signing these would give operational control away almost immediately." My stomach tightened. "Is there anything illegal here?" "Not necessarily illegal," she said, "but misleading. And your prior unauthorized submissions raise separate concerns. We'll address those." She outlined steps, requests for documentation, formal objections. The language she used was precise and calm, and hearing it steadied me further. I left her office just before 9 and drove to the title company again. The parking lot was already half full. I sat in the car for a moment, engine idling, hands resting on the wheel. Yesterday, I'd walked into that building unsure of what I was facing. Today, I stepped out carrying copies, notes, and instructions. The glass doors slid open as I entered. Karen looked up from her desk, surprised. "Good morning," she said. Brooke and Evan were already seated in the conference room when I walked in. Brooke checked her watch. "Right on time," she said. I set my bag down and took my chair. The blue folder waited in the center of the table, exactly where it had been left. Karen opened it, ready to resume. I folded my hands together and spoke before she could begin. "I won't be signing today." The silence that followed felt heavier than any document on that table. The silence in the room held for a few seconds after I said it. Karen's pen stopped moving above the page. Evan leaned back slowly, his chair creaking. Brooke didn't move at all. She just looked at me, her expression flattening in a way I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, and I told her I wasn't going along with one of her plans. "I'm sorry," Karen said carefully. "You won't be signing today?" "That's correct." Brooke's fingers curled against the tabletop. "Maya, stop playing games." "I'm not playing." Karen glanced between us, uncomfortable. "Is there a specific concern we can address?" "Yes," I said. "I need a documented record of any filings made under my name regarding zoning or development inquiries on parcel 18423. And I need confirmation of the origin of those submissions." Karen blinked. Evan shifted forward. Brooke's eyes narrowed. That has nothing to do with today's signing, Brooke said. It has everything to do with it. Karen folded her hands. I'm not sure our office. I've already requested it through the county, I said. This is just to ensure your records match. Brooke's jaw tightened. You went behind our backs? I met her gaze. You filed documents behind mine. Her mouth opened, then closed again. The air between us felt sharp. Evan leaned toward her and murmured something I couldn't hear. Karen cleared her throat. If the parties aren't in agreement, we can reschedule. That's not unusual. Brooke exhaled sharply. Fine. Reschedule. Maya, outside. She stood before anyone could respond and walked out. The command hung there, and I followed, because refusing would only escalate the scene further. The hallway was empty. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Brooke turned on me as soon as the conference room door shut. What are you doing? She demanded. Protecting what's mine. She laughed once, short and disbelieving. You think this is some conspiracy? You're blowing this up over paperwork. Paperwork you tried to rush me through. Her voice dropped. We were trying to help you manage something you barely understand. The old rhythm. Undermine first. Reframe second. Claim superiority third. I recognized it now the way you recognize a familiar smell. I understand enough, I said. And I understand that submissions were made under my name. Her eyes flickered. Just briefly. But I saw it. You're being paranoid. I verified timestamps. She stared at me for a long moment, then stepped closer. Listen, this land isn't doing anything sitting there. Evan has contacts. We could turn it into something valuable. It already is valuable. To you, she snapped. Emotionally, that's not the same thing. The words hit with more force than I expected. I looked past her at the hallway carpet, noticing a dark coffee stain shaped vaguely like a footprint. Grandpa left it to me, I said quietly. Brooke's shoulders stiffened. Grandpa made choices based on sentiment. I'm dealing with reality. Reality. The word landed like a door closing. We stood there, neither of us speaking for a few seconds. Then she shook her head. You're making this harder for everyone. Everyone meaning you. Her expression hardened fully now. You don't want to go down this road. I didn't answer. She turned and walked back into the conference room, and I followed. Karen was gathering papers when we entered. Evan checked his watch again. Looks like we're postponing, he said. Karen nodded. I'll contact both parties with new scheduling options. I picked up my bag. Brooke didn't look at me again as we left. Outside, the morning sun felt colder than it had the day before. Evan got into their SUV immediately, but Brooke lingered. You're going to regret this, she said. Maybe. She studied me, searching, then slid into the passenger seat. The SUV pulled away without another word. I stood there for a moment before heading to my own car. My phone buzzed just as I reached it. An email notification from Dylan. Found something. Call when you can. I dialed before I even started the engine. He picked up on the second ring. Okay, so I traced the submission trail further, he said. Those forms? Uploaded from a business network tied to a development consulting firm. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Which firm? He read the name aloud. It wasn't one I recognized, but I wrote it down on a receipt in my glove compartment. And, Maya, he added, there's more. Looks like preliminary site modeling files were requested. That's not casual inquiry. That's planning. I closed my eyes briefly. Thank you. After the call, I sat there listening to the engine idle. The pieces were no longer abstract. They were lined up in front of me, clear enough to see the outline forming, not just a transfer. Preparation. I drove straight to Aaron Lawson's office again and handed over the new information. She reviewed it, nodding. This supports intent, she said. We'll proceed formally. She began drafting letters, requests, notices. Watching her work felt like watching someone build scaffolding around a fragile structure. By mid-afternoon, I returned home, exhausted but steady. I spread everything across my kitchen table again. The sunlight shifted across the pages as hours passed. I organized documents into folders. Originals, copies, correspondence. At some point, I noticed how quiet the apartment was. No background television, no voices, just the sound of paper sliding and the occasional car passing outside. That quiet reminded me of evenings at Grandpa Ray's house. He rarely filled silence with noise. He believed space let you hear what mattered. I paused and looked at his photo leaning against the wall. His faded cap, the lines around his eyes. I wondered what he'd think of this situation unfolding in conference rooms instead of open fields. My phone buzzed again. A text from Brooke. You're overreacting. This could have been simple. I stared at it, then set the phone face down without replying. Night settled slowly. I made a quick dinner I barely tasted and continued reviewing until my eyes grew tired. Before bed, I locked the folder in a drawer beside my desk. As I lay there in the dark, I replayed the hallway conversation. Brooke's certainty, her warning, her assumption that I would eventually give in. For most of my life, she'd been right about that. But things had already shifted. Evidence had replaced doubt. Advice had replaced isolation. The path ahead might be complicated, but it wasn't invisible anymore. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion, a quiet realization settled in. This wasn't just about stopping a signature. It was about uncovering how far they'd already gone. Morning would bring more answers. Morning came earlier than I wanted. I woke before my alarm and lay still for a minute, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside. My mind moved immediately back to the papers, the calls, the hallway conversation. There was no drifting back to sleep. I got up, showered, and made coffee I barely tasted before heading to my desk. The folders were where I'd left them, stacked and labeled. I opened the top drawer and pulled them out, spreading them across the table again. The order I'd imposed the night before still held. Originals, copies, correspondence, notes from Aaron. I added the consulting firm name Dylan had given me to a fresh sheet of paper and circled it. At 8, my phone rang. Aaron, I've sent formal requests to the county and a notice to the title office, she said. They're required to pause proceedings while documentation questions are reviewed. That buys time. Thank you, I said. Also, she continued, I contacted the consulting firm listed in the metadata trail. They confirmed someone approached them about preliminary feasibility work. I waited. They wouldn't disclose client details without process, but they didn't deny involvement. I exhaled slowly. That's enough for now. After we hung up, I packed the folders into my bag and headed out for work. My office sat in a low building near a stretch of highway lined with warehouses and service yards. Inside, the fluorescent lights and quiet cubicles felt familiar and grounding. I greeted Dylan with a nod as I passed his desk. You good? He asked. I'm getting there. I spent the morning reviewing mapping data, tracing infrastructure overlays across terrain models. Normally, the work absorbed me completely, but today, my attention flickered. Every time my email notification chimed, my shoulders tensed. Around noon, one finally came through from the county clerk. Records show 2 submissions linked to your identification credentials within the last month, both associated with preliminary zoning and development inquiries. I stared at the screen. The confirmation didn't surprise me anymore, but seeing it documented made it real in a different way. I forwarded it to Aaron immediately. A second email arrived minutes later. Additional review indicates digital uploads included scans of identification matching your records. My stomach tightened. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples. The implication was clear. Someone had access to copies of my ID, copies I hadn't distributed. I thought back through the last year. Job applications, lease renewals, medical forms, family events. My mind stopped on a detail I hadn't revisited in a while. 2 summers ago, Brooke insisted on organizing family documents after our mother downsized apartments. She gathered everything into labeled envelopes, birth certificates, insurance copies, identification backups. I'd thanked her at the time. Efficiency was her strength. I closed my eyes briefly, then reopened them and forwarded the new information to Aaron. The rest of the workday passed in measured steps. Phone calls, data reviews, routine tasks that kept my hands moving. When 5 o'clock came, I packed up and drove straight home, tension settling heavier with each mile. Inside the apartment, I placed the bag on the table and checked messages. One voicemail from Brooke. I played it. Maya, this has gone far enough, she said. Dragging attorneys into this makes you look dramatic. Call me. I deleted the message, without responding. An hour later, the phone rang again. This time I answered. What do you want, Brooke? A pause. Then, I want you to stop escalating. I'm verifying. You're accusing. I'm protecting myself. Silence hung between us. Finally, she said, we're family. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Family doesn't file documents under someone else's name. Her voice hardened. You don't know that happened. I do. Another pause. Longer this time. You're misunderstanding intentions, she said. Explain them. She exhaled sharply. You're sitting on land you don't use. I tried to explore options. That's not a crime. Using my credentials isn't exploration. Her tone cooled. Be careful what you imply. I ended the call. My hands trembled slightly afterward, but the feeling passed. I poured water and stood by the window watching evening settle over the parking lot. Days passed in a similar rhythm. Documentation flowed back from agencies. Aaron compiled timelines. The title company acknowledged receipt of the notice and confirmed no further meetings would proceed until resolution. One afternoon, Erin called again. "We've confirmed that identification scans used in submissions were slightly outdated," she said. "That suggests stored copies, rather than recent access. The memory of those labeled envelopes returned stronger." "Understood," I replied. "We're preparing formal statements," she continued. "Depending on response, this could move beyond administrative review." After the call, I sat quietly for a long moment. The situation had crossed from suspicion into process. That boundary, once crossed, rarely reversed cleanly. That weekend, I drove back to the acreage. Wind pushed low clouds across the sky, casting moving shadows over the ground. I walked along the creek again, boots damp from soft soil. The familiar stillness steadied me. I remembered standing here with Brooke once, years earlier. She'd worn sunglasses and complained about the dust, asking why anyone would choose to spend time in a place without cell service. Grandpa had smiled and said, "Because some places aren't meant for constant contact." She'd rolled her eyes. I reached the survey marker again and brushed dirt from its base. The metal felt cool under my fingers. That boundary hadn't shifted. Whatever happened in offices and conference rooms, this line remained where it was placed. Driving back home, I considered how much had already changed. Conversations had hardened. Assumptions had cracked. Brooke's certainty no longer held the same weight it once did. When I parked and climbed the stairs to my apartment, I noticed how natural it felt now to carry documentation, to track details, to question processes. The habits were no longer reactive. They were part of how I moved through the situation. That night, Erin sent one final update. "We've submitted formal notice requesting disclosure of client representation to the consulting firm. Expect response within the week." I closed my laptop and leaned back, listening to the quiet room. Each step forward revealed more structure beneath what once seemed like isolated events. The truth wasn't hidden anymore. It was unfolding piece by piece. And with each piece, the distance between who I thought my sister was and who she was proving to be grew wider. Sleep came easier that night, not because things were resolved, but because the path ahead was finally visible enough to follow. The response from the consulting firm arrived 3 days later. I opened the email at my desk during lunch. The subject line plain and professional. "In response to your formal inquiry." I read it once, then again more slowly. They acknowledged preliminary modeling requests tied to the parcel. They confirmed that feasibility studies had been initiated. And they confirmed that contact had been established through an intermediary authorized to discuss potential development frameworks. They did not name Brooke. They did not name Evan. But the message closed with a line stating that all further communications would proceed only through legal channels. I forwarded it to Erin immediately. Within minutes, my phone rang. "This strengthens your position," she said. "It establishes pattern and intent." "Is it enough?" I asked. "It's enough to continue. I'm scheduling a formal meeting. I recommend you attend, but remain measured. Let process work." Measured. I repeated the word in my head after we hung up. It sounded calm, controlled. It was what Grandpa Ray would have advised. Never rush toward confrontation when patience yields more information. That evening, Brooke texted, "We need to talk in person." I stared at the message for a while before replying. "Where?" She sent the name of a cafe halfway between our apartments. I agreed. The place smelled like roasted beans and sugar glaze when I walked in. Brooke was already seated at a small table by the window. Her posture was straight, composed, the same confidence she wore everywhere. She gestured for me to sit. I ordered coffee and joined her. For a moment, we said nothing. Cups clinked around us. Someone laughed near the counter. "You've taken this too far," she began. I followed documentation. "You escalated documentation." I watched steam rise from my mug. "You used my identification." Her jaw tightened. "You don't have proof of that." The timestamps align. The scans match stored copies. Silence stretched. She folded her hands on the table. "You're focusing on process instead of outcome," she said. "We could have turned that property into something profitable." "I didn't ask for profit." "You're missing opportunity." I met her gaze. "You're missing consent." Her eyes flickered again. Not anger exactly. Frustration. I was trying to build something bigger. By cutting me out. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You've always thought small." The words hung between us. I didn't answer immediately. The cafe noise blurred into background hum. Finally, I said, "Grandpa didn't think small." Brooke's expression shifted, irritation sharpening. Grandpa was sentimental, ideal in reality. I finished my coffee and set the cup down. Reality includes legal boundaries. Her lips pressed thin. "You're threatening your own sister." I'm protecting myself. We sat there another minute before she stood. Do what you want, she said. But remember you started this. She walked out without looking back. I remained at the table, listening to the ambient noise settle again. The conversation hadn't resolved anything, but it clarified something important. Brooke wasn't interested in repairing trust. She was interested in regaining momentum. The formal meeting Aaron arranged took place 2 days later in a municipal office building. Neutral space. Plain furniture. Fluorescent lighting. Brooke and Evan arrived together, their expressions composed. Aaron sat beside me with a legal pad. Officials outlined findings calmly. Timeline review. Submission records. Identity verification inconsistencies. Brooke maintained that exploratory filings were conducted in good faith. Aaron countered with documentation of unauthorized credential use. Voices stayed controlled. No shouting. No dramatic moments. Just structured questions and recorded responses. When the session ended, no immediate conclusions were issued, but additional reviews were scheduled. Processes extended. Brooke and Evan left quickly afterward. Walking out into the parking lot, Aaron turned to me. You handled that well. I just answered questions. That's often enough. I drove home feeling steady but tired. The weeks of documentation, calls, and meetings were cumulative. Progress came through accumulation, not resolution. That weekend, I returned to the acreage again. The weather had warmed slightly. Early buds showed along branches near the creek. I walked the perimeter slowly, noting changes in soil and runoff. Routine observation steadied my thoughts. I paused at the midpoint, overlooking the open stretch where tall grasses would grow later in the season. I remembered standing there as a teenager, listening to Grandpa explain how ecosystems balance themselves when left undisturbed. He spoke about patience, about respecting timelines larger than immediate goals. The memory grounded me. Back home, another message waited from Aaron. Preliminary findings suggest further inquiry into identity handling may be warranted. Prepare documentation of stored records, access history if possible. I spent the evening reviewing old boxes, searching for anything related to those envelopes Brooke organized years earlier. Receipts, emails, photos. I found a picture from that day, documents spread across a dining table. Brooke smiling at the camera as she labeled folders. The timestamp confirmed the period Aaron had referenced. I forwarded it. Later that night, Brooke called again. I didn't answer. She left no voicemail. Days continued passing. Each morning brought another small update, another request, another clarification. Each step built structure around the situation. I noticed something changing in myself through it all. The instinct to defer, to smooth tension, to give Brooke space to lead, that reflex faded. In its place grew a quiet steadiness. Decisions made deliberately. Responses measured. One evening, as I organized new paperwork, I caught my reflection in the window glass. The same face as before, but the posture different. Shoulders squared. Expression settled. I turned back to the table and continued sorting. The process wasn't finished. There were still unanswered questions and pending outcomes. But the foundation beneath me felt solid now. And whatever came next, I knew I wouldn't step into it, uncertain or alone. The next message from Aaron came on a Monday morning while I was already at my desk. I had just opened a terrain dataset when my phone buzzed. They've scheduled a final review session. Attendance required. I read it twice. The phrase final review session sat differently than everything that came before. Up to that point, the process had been exploratory. Documentation requests, clarifications, interviews. Now there was structure around resolution. I stepped outside the office building and called her. What should I expect? Presentation of findings, she said. Opportunity for both sides to respond. It won't be dramatic, just factual. Do I need anything additional? Bring your documentation binder and stay calm. You've done everything right so far. I thanked her and went back inside. The rest of the workday passed in measured focus, but my mind returned repeatedly to the upcoming meeting. I reviewed my binder that evening, checking tabs and copies, emails printed, metadata screenshots labeled, photographs timestamped, notes arranged chronologically. The organization itself steadied me. It turned weeks of uncertainty into something tangible. 2 days later, I drove to the municipal office again. The building looked the same, plain concrete, reflective windows, rows of parking spaces stretching toward the road. I sat in my car for a moment before going in, resting my hands on the steering wheel and breathing slowly. Inside, Erin met me in the hallway. You ready? She asked. Yes. We entered the conference room together. Brooke and Evan were already seated. Brooke wore a navy blazer this time, posture composed, expression neutral. Evan's hands rested, folded on the table. Officials arranged documents at the far end. The meeting began without ceremony. Findings were summarized step by step. Submission logs verified. Credential inconsistencies documented. Timeline correlations presented. The tone remained professional and even, but each point added weight. Brooke responded calmly when addressed. She maintained that actions were exploratory, conducted with intent to benefit shared family interests. Aaron responded with clarification about authorization requirements and consent standards. The exchange stayed controlled. At one point, an official referenced stored identification scans used in submissions. The timestamp aligned with the period Brooke organized family documents. Brooke's expression did not change, but her shoulders shifted slightly. No conclusions were announced immediately. Instead, next procedural steps were outlined. Potential administrative actions. Documentation retention requirements. Further internal review of credential handling practices. The meeting ended the same way it began, quietly. Outside in the parking lot, Brooke approached me before I reached my car. "You're determined to drag this out," she said. "I'm following process." Her eyes searched mine. Process damages relationships. So does bypassing consent. She looked away briefly, then back. "You could still stop this." "I could, but I won't." She nodded once, lips pressed thin, and walked back toward Evan. Driving home, I felt something shift internally. The confrontation phase was behind us. What remained now was resolution and consequence, unfolding at their own pace. Weeks passed. Communication slowed. Aaron updated me occasionally on progress. Agencies completed their reviews. Responses were logged and acknowledged. During that time, I focused on routine life. Work projects, field visits, evenings spent walking along neighborhood paths. I visited the acreage again as spring deepened, noting new growth along the creek banks and increased bird activity. Each visit reminded me why I'd resisted pressure to relinquish control. One afternoon, Erin called with measured finality. "Administrative findings are complete," she said. I waited. They determined improper credential usage occurred. Safeguards are being implemented. Documentation has been archived. No further land actions can proceed without explicit verification. I exhaled slowly. "Thank you. This doesn't resolve family dynamics," she added gently, "but it resolves process risk." After the call, I sat quietly at my kitchen table, hands folded. There was no dramatic release of emotion, just a steady sense of closure on one part of the situation. That evening, Brooke sent a message. "Hope you're satisfied." I read it once and placed the phone down without replying. Days later, I received a forwarded notice summarizing institutional updates tied to the case. Language was formal, impersonal, procedural, but it marked the endpoint of the administrative journey. I printed a copy and added it to my binder, sliding the tab into place. That weekend, I drove to the acreage again. The grass had begun greening. Cottonwoods carried faint leaves. I walked the boundary markers and paused near the creek, listening to water move over stones. Standing there, I thought about the months behind me. Conference rooms, emails, meetings, conversations layered with tension. All of it had revolved around a place that remained unchanged through the process. The land didn't react. It didn't argue. It simply existed. I sat on the familiar flat stone and watched clouds move overhead. For the first time in a while, my thoughts weren't focused on documents or outcomes. They were simply present. Eventually, I stood and headed back to the car. As I closed the gate behind me, I felt a quiet recognition settle in. This chapter of confrontation had ended, not through dramatic victory or loss, but through steady adherence to process and boundaries. And whatever came next, whether reconciliation or continued distance, would unfold beyond the reach of paperwork. I drove away with the windows down, letting the air carry dust and spring scent into the car, feeling grounded in a way I hadn't since before the first blue folder crossed that conference table. The first week after Aaron told me the administrative review was complete felt strangely quiet. For months, every morning had begun with checking emails, confirming appointments, organizing notes. Now there were no urgent messages waiting, no calls scheduled, no folders needing immediate updates. The absence of tension left space that I didn't know how to fill right away. I kept my routine steady. Work remained the anchor. Mapping infrastructure corridors and updating environmental overlays gave my days structure. My coworkers didn't ask questions, and I didn't volunteer details. The situation with Brooke belonged outside fluorescent-lit cubicles and project deadlines. Still, I noticed how my body reacted differently. My shoulders were less tight. My sleep ran deeper. Even small things, like grocery shopping or washing dishes, felt less like tasks stacked on top of something heavier. One evening, as I sorted mail at my kitchen counter, I found a letter addressed in Brooke's handwriting. I turned it over for a moment before opening it. Inside was a short note. I didn't think it would turn into this. I believed I was helping. If you want to talk without attorneys or meetings, call me. I read it twice, then folded it and set it aside. I didn't call. Not because I wanted distance, but because I needed time to understand what I felt beyond relief and fatigue. That weekend, I visited the acreage again. The season had shifted further. Grass pushed through soil in uneven patches. The creek carried more water, reflecting sunlight in sharp flashes. I walked the familiar path slowly, noticing small changes. Fresh animal tracks near the bank, buds along the cottonwoods, insects skimming the surface. I brought a small notebook with me and jotted down observations, the way Grandpa Ray used to encourage. Date, weather, conditions. Writing grounded me in something physical and present. At the midpoint overlooking the open stretch, I sat down and watched clouds roll across the sky. I thought about Brooke's note, about her belief she was helping, about the months of documentation and conflict that followed. I realized both things could exist at once, intent and impact. Her intentions might have been shaped by ambition, by her way of seeing opportunity, but impact was measured by actions, and those actions had crossed boundaries. That understanding didn't bring anger. It brought clarity. Driving back into town, I stopped by Erin's office to drop off updated contact information and thank her in person. She greeted me warmly. "How are you feeling now that things have settled?" she asked. "Steady," I said. "Still processing." "That's normal. Resolution doesn't erase emotional residue." We talked briefly about long-term safeguards, account monitoring, document storage practices, periodic reviews, practical steps that would prevent similar vulnerabilities in the future. When I left her office, I felt reassured knowing the systems around the property were more secure than before. Weeks passed in gradual adjustment. Brooke didn't call again, and I didn't reach out. Distance became routine rather than painful. Family gatherings remained limited. Conversations with our mother stayed neutral, avoiding the subject entirely. I focused energy elsewhere. Work projects expanded. I volunteered with a local conservation group on weekends, helping with trail restoration and habitat monitoring. Being outdoors alongside people who valued preservation for its own sake reaffirmed why I'd protected the land. One afternoon during a volunteer shift, a retired teacher asked how I became interested in environmental mapping. I told her about Grandpa Ray and the acreage. She listened quietly, then said, "Sounds like he trusted you with more than property." The comment stayed with me long after the shift ended. Later that month, I returned to the acreage, carrying a small camera. I spent hours documenting seasonal changes, photographing the creek, the survey markers, the horizon line at sunset. The act of recording the land felt less like guarding it and more like honoring it. As dusk settled, I sat near the gate and reviewed the images. Each frame showed continuity, growth, stability, the opposite of the disruption that had surrounded ownership discussions months earlier. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. A message from Brooke. "I'm glad the land is safe. I mean that." I read it once, then again. There was no request attached, no argument, just the statement. I typed a reply slowly. "Thank you." Nothing more. It was enough. That night, I placed the binder containing all documentation into storage with other records. Not hidden away, but no longer occupying daily space on my table. Closing the drawer felt symbolic. Not final, but transitional. I poured tea and sat by the window, watching headlights pass in the parking lot below. The path from that first conference room meeting to this moment had been long and uneven. It had forced me to examine trust, boundaries, and responsibility in ways I hadn't anticipated. Yet standing there now, I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. The land remained under my stewardship. My relationships were altered but clearer. My understanding of myself was stronger. I finished my tea and turned off the lights, preparing for bed. Tomorrow would be ordinary work, errands, routine conversations. And that ordinariness itself felt meaningful. Because the story hadn't ended in confrontation or spectacle. It had settled into something quieter. Something that left room for rebuilding, for growth, and for carrying forward the lessons learned without the weight of unresolved conflict. As I drifted to sleep, I realized that protecting the land had ultimately meant protecting the part of myself that believed in patience, integrity, and steady boundaries. And that realization would guide whatever came next. Spring moved steadily toward summer, and life settled into rhythms that felt familiar again. Workdays started early, with coffee and quiet drives across town. Projects demanded attention, and I gave it willingly. Routine had a way of grounding me after months spent navigating tension and uncertainty. Still, the aftermath of everything that happened didn't disappear just because the paperwork had stopped. Consequences moved outward in quieter ways. I heard first through our mother. She called one evening, her voice careful and neutral in that practiced way she used when she didn't want to appear involved. "Brooke's been under a lot of pressure lately," she said. I leaned against the kitchen counter, phone pressed between my shoulder and ear. "I'm sorry to hear that." She mentioned some partnerships didn't work out. I didn't ask for details. I knew what partnerships she meant. Opportunities tied to the acreage had been anticipated, discussed, likely counted on. Without them, plans shifted. After we hung up, I stood still for a moment, absorbing the conversation. I didn't feel satisfaction, just a sense of inevitability. Actions ripple outward, and outcomes don't always match expectations. A few weeks later, I saw Brooke in person for the first time since the municipal meeting. It was at a small family gathering at our mother's apartment. Nothing formal, just dinner and polite conversation. Brooke arrived with Evan, both composed but quieter than usual. We exchanged brief greetings. The interaction stayed surface-level: weather, work, general updates, no mention of the past months, no acknowledgement of the tension that had reshaped things between us. Watching her move around the room, I noticed subtle changes. Less certainty in posture. More pauses before speaking. It wasn't dramatic, just human. People adapt when plans shift. I didn't judge it. I simply observed. That night, after returning home, I thought about the complexity of consequence. It wasn't clean. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't look like victory or defeat. It looked like adjustments, compromises, learning to move forward under altered conditions. The following weekend, I drove out to the acreage again. Warm air carried the scent of growing vegetation. Birds nested in the cottonwoods. The creek ran fuller now, reflecting bright midday light. I walked the perimeter slowly, noting seasonal changes. Grass reached higher against my boots. Insects buzzed low across the ground. Everything followed natural timing, indifferent to human conflict. I paused near the midpoint and sat, letting the quiet settle around me. I realized how much this place had anchored me through the entire ordeal. Each visit reinforced perspective. Paperwork and disputes occupied only small slices of time compared to the continuity of land and seasons. I took out my notebook and wrote observations. Weather conditions, wildlife presence, vegetation growth. It felt purposeful and grounding. Back at work the following week, Dylan stopped by my desk. "Haven't heard updates in a while," he said. "Things resolved," I replied. He nodded. "Good." We returned to discussing mapping datasets and projection adjustments, conversation shifting naturally back to professional territory. That simplicity reminded me how life continues, regardless of personal chapters closing. Projects replace disputes. Conversations shift topics. Forward motion resumes. Later that month, I received a call from Erin checking in. "Just making sure everything remains stable," she said. "It does." "Remember to maintain periodic monitoring of records." "I will." We spoke briefly about preventive practices, then ended the call. Her guidance had carried me through the most complicated parts of the process. Now maintenance replaced defense. Another message came from Brooke not long afterward, short and direct. "I'm restructuring some business plans. Hope things are well." I replied simply. "They are. I hope yours improve." It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't distance. It was acknowledgement of coexistence after conflict. That balance carried into the following weeks. Contact remained minimal but respectful. The hostility that once edged our conversations softened into cautious neutrality. Summer fully arrived. Heat rose off pavement during afternoon drives. The acreage turned greener, more vibrant. I spent longer hours there on weekends, sometimes bringing lunch and staying until evening shadows stretched long across the grass. One afternoon, I stood near the creek watching sunlight flicker across moving water. I thought about Grandpa Ray and the trust he'd placed in me. Protecting the land had never been about proving someone else wrong. It had been about honoring responsibility. And in doing so, I'd grown in ways I hadn't expected. I understood systems better, boundaries more clearly, my own resilience more fully. As I walked back toward the gate that day, I noticed tire tracks along the outer road, likely from passers-by or survey crews working nearby. They didn't concern me. I'd learned to distinguish between routine activity and meaningful threat. Driving home later, windows down, warm air filling the car, I felt something close to closure settle inside me. Not finality, just completion of a chapter defined by conflict and defense. Life ahead would contain other challenges, other decisions. But this one had resolved through patience and steady effort, rather than confrontation or spectacle. That understanding stayed with me as the sun set behind the mountains and the road stretched forward into evening light. Summer settled into its hottest stretch, and with it came a different kind of rhythm. The tension that had once occupied so much of my attention was no longer part of my daily routine. Instead, my focus shifted toward things I had postponed, projects at work, time outdoors, and small personal plans I'd set aside while dealing with the conflict over the land. At the office, I took on a longer-term mapping assignment involving watershed impact projections. It required field verification, which meant spending hours driving through areas where development met open terrain. Those drives reminded me constantly of why I valued untouched land. Watching construction sites edge toward foothills made the acreage feel even more important to protect. One afternoon, after returning from fieldwork, I stayed late to organize updated survey overlays. The office was quiet, except for the soft buzz of fluorescent lights. Dylan passed my desk on his way out. "You ever think about expanding your personal mapping projects?" he asked casually. "What do you mean?" "You've got land, experience, data access. Could turn it into something educational or environmental." I considered that after he left. The idea lingered as I drove home. For months, my energy had gone toward defending ownership. Now I had space to consider what active stewardship might look like. That weekend, I visited the acreage with a different mindset. Instead of just observing, I brought measuring tools and marked potential locations for future environmental monitoring points: soil conditions, water flow, vegetation density. I moved slowly, documenting everything. The process felt constructive. Purpose replaced defense. Later, sitting by the creek, I thought about Grandpa Ray again. He had never treated land as static property. To him, stewardship meant interaction, care, and awareness. Carrying that forward felt right. Back home, I began researching local conservation programs, grants, partnerships, volunteer collaborations. I didn't commit to anything immediately, but exploring possibilities opened new direction. Meanwhile, family interactions remained cautious but calm. Brooke and I exchanged occasional messages about neutral topics: work updates, logistics regarding shared family responsibilities. Nothing personal or confrontational. One evening, she called unexpectedly. "I heard you've been spending more time on the property," she said. "I have." A pause followed. "I'm glad it's meaningful to you." I appreciated the acknowledgement. "Thank you." Another pause. Then, "I misjudged some things." The words were simple, not dramatic. I didn't press further. "We both learned," I replied. We ended the call without tension. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was progress. Autumn approached gradually. Heat softened. Leaves began shifting color. I continued building a routine that included monthly site monitoring on the acreage and periodic reviews of property records. Safeguards became habit rather than reaction. Work projects expanded, and I accepted an opportunity to mentor a junior analyst joining our team. Teaching someone new reminded me how much I'd grown professionally and personally. Confidence replaced uncertainty in subtle ways. One afternoon during training, she asked how I handled complex disputes involving environmental data and property boundaries. I answered honestly. "You stay patient. You document everything, and you protect your ground without escalating beyond what's necessary." The advice reflected lessons drawn directly from recent experience. Later that week, I received an email confirming acceptance into a regional conservation workshop program. Participation meant collaborating with landowners and specialists to develop preservation strategies. I registered without hesitation. The first workshop session took place in a community center overlooking open plains. Participants ranged from farmers to environmental scientists. Listening to their perspectives broadened my understanding of land stewardship beyond personal experience. During a discussion break, one participant asked about my motivation. "My grandfather left me acreage with the expectation I'd care for it," I said. "I'm continuing that responsibility." The statement felt grounded and true. As weeks passed, I implemented ideas from the workshop: erosion monitoring, habitat documentation, seasonal reporting. These activities transformed my relationship with the property from defensive to proactive. Family dynamics continued stabilizing quietly. Holiday gatherings approached without tension, dominating conversation. Brooke and I maintained respectful distance while sharing space comfortably. The absence of conflict didn't erase the past, but it allowed present interactions to proceed without strain. One afternoon late in the season, I drove out to the acreage, carrying new monitoring equipment. Wind moved through tall grass, producing a steady rustling sound. I walked familiar paths, stopping occasionally to record measurements. Standing near the creek, I reflected on how much had shifted over the year. From uncertainty and confrontation to structure and purpose. The land remained constant, but my understanding of responsibility had deepened. I packed my tools and returned to the car as sunset colored the horizon. The drive home felt calm and reflective. Back at the apartment, I reviewed data and organized notes. The steady progression of tasks reinforced the sense of forward movement. Life wasn't defined by the conflict anymore. It was shaped by growth that followed. Before bed, I paused at the window, watching city lights flicker on across the distance. Protecting the acreage had been a catalyst. It forced me to assert boundaries, engage systems, and redefine priorities. The experience changed how I approached decisions beyond property matters. I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, knowing tomorrow would continue along the path I had intentionally built, balanced between professional focus, environmental care, and measured family relationships. The story that began in a conference room had unfolded into something broader. Not an ending, but a transition into responsibility carried forward with clarity and confidence. By the time autumn reached its peak, I had grown used to the rhythm I'd built: work, monitoring visits, conservation meetings, and quiet family interactions that stayed polite and measured. The intensity of the conflict with Brooke had faded into something distant, almost abstract, like remembering a storm after the sky cleared. Then one afternoon, I received a call that shifted that sense of distance. It came from our mother. Her voice sounded softer than usual, hesitant. "Maya, I wanted you to hear something from me directly." I sat down at my kitchen table. "Okay." She paused before continuing. "Brooke told me she's separating from Evan." I didn't respond immediately. The words didn't fit into the narrative I'd built about how everything had stabilized. "They've had disagreements for months," our mother said. "Financial strain, different expectations. It escalated recently." I thanked her for telling me and ended the call, then sat quietly absorbing the information. Evan had been central to many of the development ideas. His connections, his business ambitions. Hearing about their separation reframed parts of the past year. That evening, Brooke texted, "I assume Mom told you." I replied simply, "She did. Are you okay?" A minute passed before she answered, "I will be. Just sorting things out." I considered my response carefully. "Let me know if you need anything." There was no reply after that. Over the following weeks, the shift became visible. Brooke moved into a smaller place across town. Her schedule changed. Conversations with family turned practical rather than strategic. The confidence she once projected seemed replaced by something quieter. We met for coffee one afternoon at her suggestion. It was the same cafe where we'd argued months earlier. Sitting across from her now felt different. She stirred her drink slowly. "I've been thinking about everything," she said. I waited. I pushed too hard. On a lot of things, the land included. The admission wasn't dramatic. It was matter of fact. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. She nodded. "Evan and I were planning expansion projects. I saw your acreage as an opportunity. I convinced myself you'd eventually agree." I watched her hands resting on the table. No defensive tension, just honesty. "I should have asked," she added. "Yes," I said. "You should have." We talked for a while longer, conversation moving between past and present. It wasn't emotional reconciliation, it was recognition. Two adults acknowledging where decisions diverged and why. When we parted, there was no dramatic closure, just mutual understanding that the relationship would continue in a new form. That interaction stayed with me as the season shifted toward winter. It represented something more complex than resolution or justice. It showed how consequences ripple into unexpected areas, reshaping lives beyond initial conflict. Around the same time, I received a letter from Aaron containing final documentation, confirming all administrative safeguards were permanently implemented. Ownership protections strengthened. Monitoring systems active. No outstanding actions pending. I filed it alongside earlier records and closed the binder for what felt like the last time. Snow arrived lightly that December. I drove out to the acreage one morning after the first dusting, boots crunching over frozen ground. The creek moved slower, edges glazed with ice. Cottonwood stood bare against a pale sky. I walked to the familiar midpoint and stood quietly, hands in my coat pockets. The cold air sharpened every sound and sensation. This place had witnessed my uncertainty, my resistance, my growth. Standing there now felt different than standing there months earlier. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just grounded. I thought about Brooke's separation, about the paths people take when pursuing ambition without balance, about how easily intentions become entangled with outcomes. None of it was simple. On the drive home, I realized something else. The story I had carried in my mind about my sister, one-dimensional, driven only by entitlement, had shifted. She was more complex than that. Pressures, influences, and misjudgments shaped her decisions just as my experiences shaped mine. That realization didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. Back in town, life continued moving forward. Work projects evolved, conservation workshops progressed. I began mentoring more actively, sharing experiences with others, navigating land stewardship challenges. Helping them avoid pitfalls I'd encountered brought quiet satisfaction. At a year-end workshop session, a participant asked what had been the most difficult part of protecting my property rights. I considered before answering. Letting go of assumptions, I said. About people, outcomes, and how conflict unfolds. The group listened quietly, and I felt the truth of those words settle fully. That night, returning home through softly falling snow, I understood that the most unexpected twist of the entire experience wasn't the administrative findings or family adjustments. It was the realization that protecting something meaningful often reveals truths you didn't anticipate about yourself and the people around you. And those truths remain long after the paperwork ends. Winter carried on quietly after that snowfall, settling into short days and cold mornings that left frost clinging to car windows. Life no longer revolved around conflict or documentation. Instead, it moved through steady routines that felt earned rather than automatic. I kept working, kept mentoring, and kept visiting the acreage whenever weather allowed. One Saturday in January, I drove out under a pale sky streaked with thin clouds. Snow remained in shaded patches along the road, but most of the ground lay exposed again, flattened grass bending under the cold. I parked by the gate, pulled on gloves, and stepped out into air sharp enough to sting my lungs. The property looked different in winter light. Edges seemed clearer, shapes simpler. I walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching on frozen soil, pausing to check markers out of habit. None had shifted. Everything remained where it belonged. When I reached the creek, I crouched and brushed ice from the surface with my glove. Water moved beneath, steady and quiet. Watching it reminded me of how time had passed through the last year, sometimes turbulent, sometimes still, always continuing forward. I stayed there for a while, letting the silence settle around me. No phone calls, no paperwork, no urgency. Just space. Driving home later, I stopped at a hardware store and bought supplies I'd been meaning to pick up. Weatherproof posts, a small metal sign, and mounting brackets. The project wasn't necessary, but it felt appropriate. The following weekend, I returned to the acreage with tools. The ground resisted slightly as I positioned the post near the entrance. It took patience and steady pressure to secure it properly. When I finished, I attached the sign. Caldwell Stewardship Property Conservation Maintained. It wasn't about ownership display. It was a marker of responsibility carried forward. I stepped back and looked at it, satisfied with its simplicity. As winter eased into early spring again, my routine visits became less about recovery and more about intention. I tracked wildlife return patterns, soil moisture changes, and vegetation emergence. The conservation workshop expanded into a collaborative project, and I shared data gathered from the land to contribute to regional environmental mapping. At work, my supervisor offered me a leadership role, overseeing broader terrain modeling initiatives. I accepted, recognizing how much confidence I'd built navigating difficult processes. Decision-making came easier now, grounded in experience rather than hesitation. Family life also found its own balance. Brooke and I spoke occasionally, conversations natural and unforced. She continued rebuilding her personal and professional direction after separating from Evan. There were no lingering arguments between us, only a mutual understanding, shaped by what we'd been through. One afternoon, she joined me at the acreage for the first time since everything had happened. We walked together along the creek in quiet observation. She didn't critique or suggest development ideas. She simply looked around. "It's peaceful," she said. "Yes," she nodded slowly. "I see why you fought for it." That acknowledgement carried more weight than any earlier apology. We didn't discuss the past in detail. We didn't need to. Presence itself was enough. Months later, as the anniversary of the initial conference room meeting approached, I found myself reflecting on the entire journey. I sat at my kitchen table one evening, binder closed beside me, tea cooling in my hands. The fluorescent-lit tension of that morning felt distant now, almost belonging to another version of myself. Back then, I walked into uncertainty, relying on instinct and fragments of understanding. Now, I understood systems, documentation, and boundaries in ways I hadn't before. More importantly, I understood my own resilience. Protecting the land hadn't just preserved acreage. It reshaped my sense of identity. It taught me patience in confrontation, clarity in communication, and strength in quiet persistence, lessons that extended far beyond property lines. On a warm spring afternoon marking that anniversary, I drove out one more time. Grass stood tall again, cottonwoods full with leaves, creek moving clear and lively. I walked to the midpoint and sat on the familiar stone, letting sunlight warm my face. I thought about Grandpa Ray and the trust he placed in me, about Brooke and the complexity of our relationship, about the process that tested and strengthened my resolve. Everything that had unfolded led here to a place unchanged, yet carrying deeper meaning. Before leaving, I stood by the new sign at the gate and ran my hand across its surface. The metal felt warm from the sun. Responsibility, stewardship, continuity. Those were the words that mattered now. Driving back toward town, windows down, I felt calm, certainty, rather than triumph. Justice had never been about defeating someone. It had been about maintaining integrity, respecting boundaries, and allowing consequences to unfold naturally. That understanding settled fully as I pulled into my apartment complex and turned off the engine. The story that began with a pen sliding across a conference table ended not with spectacle, but with clarity. And clarity, I realized, was far more lasting than any moment of victory.